Hi everyone and welcome back to the garden. Yes, it's definitely starting to feel like autumn now. So you can see from the tree leaves in the distance there, they're starting to turn now. And whilst it's still mild, it's just about t-shirt weather, things are starting to slowly dip into winter now. And I wanted to begin my series of videos probably long after a lot of you already tidied away most of your plants and prepared things for winter. Obviously I'm a bit behind things here, but I thought it'd be a good idea to get a video about protecting tree ferns, Dicksonia Antartica. These amazing plants around me here. They're incredible to grow and they just need a little bit of care to keep them going through the winter months. So in today's video I want to look at when I protect them, how I protect them, the different levels of protection you might need, as well as a couple of tips on how you can get them growing really strongly and get even bigger fronds next spring. It's just started raining typically, that fine sort of drizzly mist, but we'll crack on with the video anyway. So I think the first thing when it comes to tree ferns is that there's so much information out there. Everyone seems to have their own method of protecting them in terms of what they actually do, how little protection they give them and when they do it. And it tends to range from people just putting some leaves in the crown and saying that that's all they do, that's all they've ever needed to do. Whereas other people wrap the whole thing up and go full belts and braces, basically make it look like it's going off to a mission in the Arctic. Now, I don't think there's a need quite for that, but equally, what I'm going through is just my methods that I use. These are the methods I've had good success with, but I'm not saying it's the only way. And like any kind of exotic plant that you're willing to overwinter in your garden, you have to learn to experiment and find out what works for you. Because every garden's different, every location's different, and every single winter's different. But hopefully, the methods and the procedures that I use set you up for most normal winters, and also give you another level of protection in reserve in case things get really cold. Hopefully they don't, but who knows what's around the corner. Today's video then is all about Dicksonia Antartica, the Tasmanian tree fern, which is definitely the most commonly available tree fern here in the UK. You can buy them as small plants from garden centres, where they actually resemble large sort of ground ferns really, and I will be looking later in the video about the protection I use for younger plants, for potted tree ferns, because they're not quite as tough as those that you've got planted out in the ground. But I will be looking at bigger ones like the one behind me shortly. Before I go into the specific protection methods that I use, I thought it'd be a good idea just to look at the different parts of a tree fern, because once you understand the parts that are crucial to protect, then you understand why I actually use the methods that I do. Looking at the tree fern behind me then, the first thing you might notice are these. These are the old fronds from previous years, and on this particular plant I've chosen to leave them on. It's more of an aesthetic decision really. I think as long as you only chop them off when they're brown, it doesn't really matter too much to the plant, but on this particular one I've left them on purely because I like the look of it. I think it's a really sort of unique look for a tree fern. I really think it adds that authentic jungle vibe, but other than that it's the same probably as the tree fern that you've got at home. So starting at the top then, you've got the fronds from this year. They're still green, and whether those fronds stay evergreen or turn brown, it entirely depends on where you've got the tree fern, how sheltered it is, and the kind of winter that we have. So in mild winters, or if you live in London or on the south coast, chances are tree ferns for you, they're an evergreen plant. But for most of the places, in most winters, you will get a bit of damage to those old fronds. So it's not unusual to get this lovely green turn to a brown, blacken off over the next couple of months. It's entirely natural, and it's not one of those things that you need to worry too much about, because the actual tree fern itself is a lot tougher than these fronds are. And these fronds generally, they blacken or brown off at around -3. All it takes is really hard frost, or potentially sometimes a freezing fog, and that's it, they go brown. But you don't need to worry about those, because the actual bit you want to protect is inside the tree fern here. This crown here, with all the fronds coming out of it, in the middle there, you've actually got the new fronds for next year, just getting ready to unfurl next spring. So that is the most tender part of the plant inside there. At the minute, those new fronds are actually quite deep down, but as winter progresses and spring comes around the corner, they're nearer the top. So those are a crucial part of the plant to protect. And in fact, the whole sort of top foot of the trunk, that's the most tender part of the plant. That's where most of the growing point is. Before I move on then to my nice and easy 3-step method to protecting your tree fern, let's address a few of the questions that you might have, or some of the myths that you might have heard about protecting tree ferns. And I suppose a good start is, if the actual fronds from this year, if there's a good chance they might not make it through to next year, why don't I make protection so much easier, chop them all off now, then you can just cover the whole plant? Well, actually, that's a really bad idea. I can get why it's a tempting option, just to cut it off, protect it, job done, but the chances are that those fronds might actually make it through the winter, and it's important for the plant you don't chop them off now, because those fronds currently, they're quite upright, and as next year's fronds push through, they'll actually slowly extend outwards, the weight of those fronds will hang down and it'll open that crown up. And what happens if you chop them off now in their upright position is, because they're green currently, you chop them off, they'll set hard in that position. So potentially over the years, just by chopping the fronds off a bit too early before winter, they can lock into position and actually cause that crown to narrow. If there's less room for the new fronds, if nothing else, you get a less impressive looking plant. So I think it's really important to keep those fronds on. Don't chop them off yet, and if you are going to chop them off, wait until next spring. Wait until they've definitely gone brown, they're withered and they're starting to dry up a bit, then chop them off. Another question you might have, is it worth just wrapping the whole tree fern up now, giving it a thorough wrapping, and that's it done till spring? Well, unfortunately, whilst you might think you're doing the best thing for the plant, that can actually be detrimental for its long-term health. And yes, whilst you're wrapping most of that cold out, unfortunately you're not giving the plant a chance to breathe, and also you might be cutting off most of its moisture. Tree ferns, they actually thrive in cooler, wetter air. They enjoy that humidity, that fresh moisture coming down, and if you cut off all that rain from it, it might end up just drying out inside that wrapping. So definitely they're a plant that you want to leave exposed to as much of that cool, wetter air as possible, and you only want to wrap it when you absolutely need to. So that's why I've got a 3-step process, and why I don't go full wrap into it as soon as October hits. It's definitely something that you want to wrap for as little time as possible and let it enjoy as much of that moisture and as much of that cooler, fresh air as it possibly can. If your question is simply, do I need to wrap my tree fern? Then like I mentioned earlier, there's so many different factors, but the main one is definitely location. If you live in London, on the south coast, anywhere mild really, that usually only sees temperatures just below freezing in winter, then you don't really need to wrap the tree fern, not unless there's some really exceptional cold forecast. And as long as you've got that crown protected, then you should be absolutely fine. If you live somewhere like me here in North Lincolnshire, where the winter might be a colder one, it might be mild, you never really know, then it's always worth having that protection ready. But again, I still don't wrap the whole tree fern preemptively. What I do is give it a level of protection, but then I have the fleece ready in case I need to up that protection and there's a real cold spell forecast. Whereas if you live somewhere known for colder winters, that's maybe on the edge of the places where you can grow tree ferns, in those kind of places you might want to wrap the tree fern more heavily earlier in the winter. But it entirely depends on how much time you've got available, how keen you are to keep an eye on the forecasts, and how prepared you want to be. The actual positioning of your tree fern in your garden, it's also a factor too. Tree ferns, they're woodland plants and they enjoy growing somewhere sheltered. If you've got them growing near to your house, maybe close to a brick wall where they get some of that radiated heat, or there's any kind of overhead cover, even a deciduous tree above, it helps keep some of that frost away and shelters it from a bit of that wind. And it's a shelter from the wind that's as crucial as shelter from the cold, because those cold, dry northerly or easterly winds, that's what's going to dry your tree fern out and cause it to freeze through so much quicker. And if you do live somewhere exposed, if you know that the tree fern's going to be impacted by those really strong winter winds, then it's potentially worth wrapping it up a little bit earlier and at slightly milder temperatures than you would in other locations. There's a lot of different factors, but if you remember that a tree fern likes to grow somewhere sheltered, the further you are away from that, the more wrapping and winter protection you possibly have to do. So shelter and microclimates are definitely a thing. And here in the garden, I've got one small tree fern planted alongside a brick shed, which is technically south facing. It's got overhead cover from other tree ferns, and that small plant actually stayed green all winter last winter, when all the other taller plants around it turned brown. So it definitely is a big thing, and a degree or two can make all the difference. But let's move on then to my 3-step method. Before, I have a quick look at one top tip that will help your tree fern not just through winter, but set it up well for next spring too. I should probably apologise for all the talking so far. You maybe clicked in this video for a nice, easy, practical demonstration, but I think it's important to understand the different factors and to make sure you're using the right protection for your garden. So let's move on to an actual practical display of how I protect my tree ferns. And this example, this is the tree fern that I actually planted early this spring. It's done really well here under the shade of this tree. It's maybe battled with this gunner a little bit, but I quite like how they look together, so it's definitely staying here. And like I mentioned before, the most tender part of the plant that I'm actually going to protect is the actual crown. Because in here, deep between these fronds, you've got next year's croziers getting ready to slowly unfurl. And that's the most tender part of the plant. And because it's on the top, it's also the most vulnerable to frost damage. So step 1 is protect the crown. Now here, you've probably got a nice visual clue as to one method you can use, which is leaves. These leaves have naturally fallen from this cherry tree and they've just gathered there. But I can grab some more, collected nicely by that gunner, and just push those into the crown. And that's one method that you can use, and if you live somewhere milder, somewhere more sheltered, that could be all you need to do. You might hear some people that recommend using oak leaves because they take quite a while to break down, but really I think any kind of leaf in there, it's going to protect it and just give it a little bit of a blanket from the worst of those frosts. Another product that you can use to protect that crown, it's straw. Now you can obviously get this from farms with permission obviously, you can get it from equestrian shops, pet food shops, any kind of agricultural type shop should have straw in. And it's important to get straw rather than hay, because hay often contains a lot of grass seed, and you'll find out about that next spring when you've got areas of lawn just appearing in your borders. But this straw, it's another method, tried and tested, that you can use to actually put into that crown. And all you do with this is just put it in the crown and push it in like that. And if you push it in a fair bit, it generally stays quite tightly in there, unless you get an absolutely blustery day, in which case it might start to disappear. So straw can be good, it can protect it, it's probably not a permanent solution, and I know some people say that it can actually trap that moisture in. Personally, I've not found that to be an issue. If it was a palm, then you definitely don't want a load of wet matter packed in around it, because they're really susceptible to humidity damage. Whereas tree ferns, I think with them being more woodland plants, it shouldn't be a problem. And I suppose really, there's not much difference between straw and leaves, so that is another great method you can use. So one thing you might notice with both of these two is that leaf straw, they can be blown away, and there is a more permanent solution. So let's have a quick look at using fleece. One of those phrases that you might hear a lot that probably seems obvious is put a ball of fleece in the crown. Not in everyday life obviously, but when it comes to these kind of videos and protecting tree ferns. And basically horticultural fleece, this stuff here, you can get different grades of it, but for making into a ball, it doesn't really matter, just get any. And all you need to do, tear a bit off and scrunch it up, don't be too tight, get plenty, and make it into a ball shape. Probably self-explanatory, but I thought I'd just show you anyway. And this fleece, it's not going to generate any warmth in itself, but it traps air inside. So what you're getting is basically a way of keeping that frost off the crown itself. And again, you can actually combine this with the straw, with the leaves, and just push it straight into that crown. It could be as simple as that, but what I like to do is just tie off a few ends of it around those fronds, maybe some of the dead fronds that are hanging down, just to really secure it in, so you know that even if it's a windy day and then it becomes a frosty night, you've still got that protection and you don't have to worry about it. And generally speaking, this is how I protect my tree ferns every winter. And what I do, I don't worry about those first mild autumn frosts where you just get a slight bit of frost maybe on your car windscreen or the grass, but as temperatures start to drop and as we get temperatures at or below freezing forecast, I'll then protect the crown using either the straw, the leaves, the fleece, or maybe a bit of all three. I just chuck it in like that, and then I know that that tree fern is set for winter. So you might be wondering then where step 2 comes in. Well, in a mild winter, that would be all you need to do. In a winter where it only dips down to -2, -3 with some infrequent cold spells, then that is literally the full job. But if there is a colder spell on the horizon, if you're watching that forecast and it starts to like -4, -5s are likely, or there's an extended period of cold, then you do need to up your protection. And the easiest way of doing that, like I said earlier in the video, it's this top foot of trunk that's important. And again, that's where some more fleece comes in handy. So what I do, I get one end and I maybe tie it to one of these fronds, and then I just wrap the whole foot of trunk. You can double it up if you want, go over it a couple of times, use a fair amount of fleece, you've got it wrapped around it a few times, and I just wrap up like a mummy that top foot of trunk. And that is my next level of protection. So personally, I like to start winters with step 1, logically. As soon as the first frost is forecast, from October through to December, I think about protecting that crown. And that, done with the 3 methods I've shown you, that some winters is enough. But then as soon as there's more cold on the horizon, I get some more fleece and wrap up that top foot of trunk. And again, that should be absolutely fine in most winters. I suppose if you wanted to, and if you live somewhere colder, there's nothing wrong with wrapping up that top foot of trunk, you know, from October anyway. It will take it all winter like that because you've still got plenty of trunk to get more moisture in. So they're the first 2 methods that I use, but what you might be thinking is, where does step 3 come in? And that's for the real cold. Now, again, it's using more fleece, and you can probably guess what I'm going to do. And it's basically get a big bit of fleece and wrap up the rest of that trunk. Because if it's going to look like there's an extended period of cold, if it's going to drop to -5, -6, less than that, and there's extended freezing for days on end, then you do need to give your tree fern more protection. Because no matter how much you've covered the crown, If it's freezing for days on end, then that plant is going to slowly freeze through. So you need to do everything you can to stop that cold getting through it, especially if there's also a strong wind at the same time, like a beast in the east type scenario. So what I do in advance, maybe a few days before this real cold sets in, I get a big roll of fleece. I always keep one in the shed just ready. Basically put it next to the whole trunk and wrap the whole thing up with it. I go around a good few times and then tie it off, use either like a bungee cord or a cable tie, something like that. Then that plant is set for pretty much any cold that the winter can chuck at it. Yes, in a 2010 style winter, they're really going to suffer, but realistically, for most modern cold that we might experience, that is pretty much all you need to do. And I would just stress that wrapping the whole trunk is something that I only do for short durations. So to give you an example, in the spring, well, should I say late winter, this year we experienced in 2021, February, March time, I wrapped it up for about a week and a half. But as soon as I knew that deep cold has gone, I took off the wrapping lower down the trunk and just left the bit around the top. So that's my 3-step method of approaching tree fern winter protection for Dicksonia Antarctica anyway. And it might seem like a fair bit of work, it might seem like you're always having to monitor the weather, but in practice it's not actually that bad. And I think it's probably the best compromise in terms of efficiency, making sure you do protect your tree fern, and also not letting it dry out. And that leads me nicely on to my top tip for keeping your tree ferns growing strongly through winter and setting them up for big fronds next year. It's watering. It's really easy to think it's winter, the sun's not shining anymore, you're not having to go out and water any part of your garden to forget about your tree ferns. But it really is absolutely crucial that you keep watering them, especially when there's dry spells in winter. Now, you don't have to water them every day, and I generally, as a rule, if it's not rained, twice a week should be absolutely fine. Just get a hose, get a sprinkler, give them a bit of a spray down, do it with a watering can. I think it's something that you'd really need to keep on top of, because in winter you can actually go for weeks on end, maybe not this winter, we'll see, but you can go for weeks on end, dry spells, and that combined with the wind can really dry your tree fern out. So whenever it's not freezing, whenever there isn't a frost forecast, I like to give them a good soak in. You might hear some people say don't water them into the crown when it's cold, and I do follow that as a general rule, but I don't get too precious about it, because obviously when it rains, that rains into the crown anyway. But I like to give the trunk a good soak in, maybe every 3 or 4 days it hasn't rained. It's just a good thing to follow, and that'll set your tree fern up for good growth next year. But let's look now at young tree ferns, potted tree ferns, and a couple of considerations for those during the winter months. Here then, in a shady spot in the middle of the garden, we've got a young Dicksonia Antartica, and it's hiding under the fronds of this larger specimen here, which gives it a lovely shady sheltered spot, tree fern above it and a tree above that. So it gives it a good bit of protection against the frost. So I think it's important, if you've got a young plant, to plant it somewhere suitable where it does get a bit of shelter and a bit of shade. But when those frosts come, a light frost isn't going to hurt it. It's still a tough, generally evergreen fern, but I think it's important to keep these fronds green, because as a young plant it doesn't have that energy stored in the trunk, it doesn't have the same protection that an older, larger plant would. So what I tend to do when it approaches freezing is cover the whole plant over with fleece. Just put a few layers of fleece over the top of it, weigh it down a bit, and that should be fine. But if there's deeper frost forecast, deeper cold even, or a hard frost, then I like to go a bit better with protection and put a load of straw or multiple layers of fleece over the top. Try to create a sort of temporary enclosure over the top of it, fold these fronds in, really put some straw over the top, then fleece over the top of them too. Obviously, I only leave it on for the duration of the cold, then I go back to putting the fleece on as and when I need it. It sounds a bit of a faff, but with these younger plants, like I said, they're not quite as tough, so it's worth going the extra mile to keep them green and keep them growing strongly next year. When it comes to tree ferns in pots then, there are a couple of important considerations. Firstly, a pot can freeze through quickly. Unlike a plant that's in the ground that's got that residual warmth under the earth, a plant that's in a pot is exposed on all sides, so when it does get cold and stays cold for more than a day or two, that pot can easily just freeze through, and a plant that's got frozen roots is a plant that could be in trouble. And as well as the cold, drying out is also a risk. When you've got a plant that's in a small pot, it doesn't get a lot of rainfall, so even though it might rain and the ground might be sodden outside, that pot might not see a lot of that rain. And when you've got that, combined with a strong wind that can dry it out too, especially if it's a terracotta pot, then that again isn't an ideal situation for any plant, let alone a tree fern. So I think in winter, there's 2 crucial things for potted tree ferns. One is be on top of the watering. I know it's a general tip for the ones that are in the ground too, but with a potted plant, it's really crucial. You need to stay on top of it, make sure that compost or soil doesn't dry out. And number two, to protect it from the cold, I think it's really important to move it somewhere sheltered, and potentially, now we're in November, I would actually move that plant, especially if it's a small one that's easily moved. I would bring it in somewhere close to your house, somewhere sheltered from strong winds and away really from the frosty or the coldest part of your garden. That's generally what I'd do. And then you potentially could move it into a garage, a polytunnel, a greenhouse, if the temperatures look to dip and it looks like a really cold spell coming up. But I wouldn't do that all winter long, because those environments, again, they're not ideal for a tree fern. They heat up quickly, you can't control the moisture too much, you can't control the humidity. So what I do, nice and easy, move it into your house and then just keep an eye on the forecasts. If there looks to be a prolonged freezing spell coming up, temperatures lower than -5, at that point then I'd move it somewhere else or give it some real proper wrapping, give it plenty of fleece, and that should be enough. It's starting to get a bit dark now. Max has come out to say hello, so it's time to bring the video to a close. A bit of a long one, but hopefully not too much rambling and plenty of helpful info, especially if it's your first year looking after tree ferns. Like I said, they are tougher than you'd expect. As long as you protect them when they need it and keep them watered when it's dry, you'll be absolutely fine. But if you want more info on growing tree ferns, I'll put a link up there to a video I did covering all aspects of the cultivation, from planting out, choosing the right position, watering, soil, everything like that. If you're watching this on a TV, then just click my profile, go in there, and there's loads of other videos on tree ferns and all kinds of other exotics. So thanks for watching, and as always, if there's anything else you want to know, any of the questions you might have, drop me a comment below and I'll get back to you quickly. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.